On a cold, dark night, Emma found herself alone in the cemetery of the small town where she had grown up. The tombstones, illuminated by the faint moonlight, seemed to watch her as she wept at the graves of her parents. At the age of 17, Emma's life had changed drastically. A tragic car accident had taken her parents from her, leaving her alone and adrift. With a heavy heart and tear-filled eyes, Emma decided she couldn't stay in the village. The small community that had once provided her with solace and familiarity now only reminded her of her loss. She needed to start over, find a new path. So, with few belongings and a heart full of uncertainty, Emma set out for the big city, hoping to find an opportunity that would allow her to survive and perhaps one day thrive. The city was intimidating and chaotic, a stark contrast to the tranquility of her rural home. The streets were filled with hurried people, the noise of cars and street vendors filling the air. Emma, with her modest suitcase, felt overwhelmed but determined. She wandered the city for days, looking for work, a place to stay, anything that could offer her a glimmer of hope. It was on one of those days that Emma met Mrs. Margaret. In the middle of a bustling market, Emma, exhausted and hungry, stumbled and almost fell. Mrs. Margaret, a middle-aged woman with an imposing presence and a kind heart, helped her up. "Are you all right, child?" she asked in a warm voice that belied her stern appearance. Emma, with tears in her eyes, told Mrs. Margaret her story. Moved by the young woman's sadness and determination, Mrs. Margaret decided to help her. She offered her a job at her house and a place to stay. "You can work with me in the house, and you will learn to lead a decent life," said Mrs. Margaret, extending her hand with a smile. Accepting the offer with gratitude, Emma began a new stage in her life. Mrs. Margaret's house was large and elegant, a reflection of the position and respect she held in the community. Emma worked diligently, cleaning and assisting with household chores. Mrs. Margaret not only provided her with a job, but also with guidance and emotional support. "In this house, you will learn to fend for yourself," she would say, as she taught her how to manage finances and be independent. Every morning, Emma would get up at dawn to start her workday. Her tasks included cleaning the spacious rooms, washing clothes, and helping in the kitchen. Although the work was arduous, Emma always carried it out with dedication and care. "I want everything to be impeccable," Mrs. Margaret would tell her, watching her with a critical yet kind look. As the days went by, Emma began to better understand Mrs. Margaret's expectations. "Here, you not only work for me, but you also learn to take care of yourself," Mrs. Margaret reminded her. Under her tutelage, Emma learned to manage her finances, something she had never had to do before. "Saving a part of what you earn is important, Emma. It will help you in the future," Mrs. Margaret advised her, as she taught her to keep track of her expenses and income. The relationship between Emma and Mrs. Margaret grew stronger over time. Mrs. Margaret became a mother figure to Emma, someone she could confide in and seek advice from. "I will always be here to help you," Mrs. Margaret assured her, and Emma knew those words were sincere. Over time, Emma began to feel more comfortable and secure in her new life. The daily routine provided her with a sense of stability that she hadn't experienced since the death of her parents. In addition, Mrs. Margaret's kindness and support gave her the strength to move forward. "I am very grateful for everything you do for me, Mrs. Margaret," Emma would often say. Little by little, Emma began to dream of the future. Despite the difficulties she had faced, her resilient spirit allowed her to look ahead with hope. "One day I want to have my own place, a home that is mine," Emma thought, and she began to save every penny she could to make that dream a reality. Mrs. Margaret, always attentive to Emma's needs and aspirations, noticed this new spark in her protégée. "It's good to have dreams and goals, Emma," she said one day, as they shared a quiet moment in the kitchen. "But remember, you must be patient and persistent. Good things come to those who know how to wait and work for them." Months passed, and Emma continued to work hard. Her dedication and Mrs. Margaret's guidance not only improved her economic situation, but also gave her a new perspective on life. Emma began to see the world differently, with a mixture of pragmatism and hope. Finally, after much effort and saving, Emma had enough money to take an important step in her life. With her accumulated savings, she approached Mrs. Margaret with a proposal. "Mrs. Margaret, I've been saving, and I think I'm ready to buy a small house," Emma said, with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Mrs. Margaret smiled with pride. "I'm very proud of you, Emma. You've worked hard and earned this," she replied, before revealing a surprise. "In fact, I have a small house that I would love to sell to you. It's close by, in a quiet neighborhood. I think it would be the perfect place for you." Emma couldn't believe what she was hearing. Mrs. Margaret's offer was more than she had hoped for. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Margaret. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for me," Emma said, tears of gratitude welling up in her eyes. The transaction was completed quickly, and Emma found herself with the keys to her new house in hand. The small house was modest, but to Emma, it represented much more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of her independence, of her ability to overcome adversity and build a better future for herself. Emma moved into her new home with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The first night, as she settled into her new bed, she reflected on everything that had happened. "I've come a long way since I lost my parents," she thought. "But thanks to Mrs. Margaret's kindness and my own efforts, I'm building a new life." As the days went by, Emma worked tirelessly to make her new house a true home. She painted the walls, arranged the furniture, and planted flowers in the small garden. Every little detail was a reflection of her love and dedication. Mrs. Margaret visited often, offering advice and support. "Remember, Emma, this house is just the beginning. Keep working hard and never lose sight of your dreams," she would say. Emma, with a smile, always replied, "I will, Mrs. Margaret. Thank you for believing in me." In that period of relative calm, a significant change was about to shake her life. James, Mrs. Margaret's son, was returning after spending several years abroad. James was a young man, attractive and full of confidence. His presence in the city did not go unnoticed. His charisma and appearance attracted glances and whispers wherever he went. Emma met him at one of the dinners Mrs. Margaret organized to celebrate his return. From the first moment, James was kind and attentive to Emma. "I've heard a lot about you," he told her with a charming smile. "My mother holds your dedication and work in high regard." Emma, though somewhat shy at first, could not help but be drawn to James's confidence and charm. Their conversations were easy and full of laughter, and soon Emma found herself eagerly awaiting any opportunity to cross paths with him at Mrs. Margaret's house. James, for his part, quickly noticed Emma's interest and did not hesitate to take advantage of it. With a mixture of sweet words and gallant gestures, James began to court her discreetly. "You are different from anyone else I've ever met," he whispered in moments alone. "Your sincerity and strength inspire me." Despite the obvious attraction between them, there was a dark secret that James was hiding. He was engaged to Claire, the daughter of an influential politician. This union was seen by many as a strategic move that would benefit both families. However, the attraction and excitement of the secret relationship with Emma was something that James was not willing to give up. Weeks went by, and the relationship between Emma and James intensified. They met in hidden places, away from prying eyes. For Emma, these moments were both exciting and agonizing. "What are we doing?" she would ask, worried about the consequences. "We're risking too much." But James always knew how to calm her fears. "Trust me, Emma. Everything will be all right," he would assure her as he enveloped her in a hug. One day, Emma began to feel strange, with constant dizziness and nausea. Concerned, she decided to see a doctor. The news she received left her in shock. She was pregnant. Emma's world was shaken. "How am I going to face this alone?" she thought as tears rolled down her cheeks. Summoning all her courage, she decided to tell James about her pregnancy. In a secret meeting, she revealed the news to him. "James, I'm pregnant," she said in a trembling voice. James's reaction was one of disbelief and worry. "This complicates everything," he murmured, putting his hands to his head. Emma, expecting support and understanding, was devastated by James's response. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. James, however, had no clear answers. "Let me think," was all he could say before walking away hastily. Emma's situation became desperate. Not only did she face the fear of being a single mother, but she also faced uncertainty about her future with James. Mrs. Margaret's words echoed in her mind. "Keep working hard and never lose sight of your dreams." But at that moment, those dreams seemed further away than ever. Over time, James's absence became more noticeable. His promises to find a solution vanished into thin air. Emma, feeling betrayed and alone, decided that she had to make difficult decisions to protect her son and herself. The news of her pregnancy continued to reverberate in Emma's mind like an incessant echo. Every morning, the first thought that crossed her mind was the same: "I'm pregnant." Fear and anxiety mingled with a deep sense of loneliness. Despite Mrs. Margaret's support, Emma knew she had to make decisions for herself. One afternoon, as she organized the few savings she had, Emma felt a wave of despair. She couldn't just sit around waiting for James to make good on his empty promises. She needed a plan, a way out of the situation she was in. With trembling hands, she decided to talk to Mrs. Margaret, hoping to find some kind of guidance or support. Mrs. Margaret received her in her living room with her usual calmness and compassion. "Emma, my dear, you look worried. What's wrong?" she asked gently. Emma, feeling the words catch in her throat, finally confessed, "Mrs. Margaret, I'm pregnant with James's child. I don't know what to do. I need your help." Mrs. Margaret's face hardened slightly, but her eyes showed understanding. "This is serious, Emma. Does James know?" Emma nodded, feeling tears threaten to spill. "Yes, I told him, but he hasn't done anything about it." Mrs. Margaret sighed, making a difficult decision. "Emma, I will help you, but there is something you must understand. James has a commitment to Claire, and breaking that commitment would have serious consequences for our family. I need you to understand that." Emma felt a pang of betrayal, but maintained her composure. "What can I do then? I can't raise this child alone." Mrs. Margaret looked at her seriously. "I will support you financially and make sure you have a safe place to live. But James must fulfill his commitment. We cannot allow a scandal." Mrs. Margaret's words fell on Emma like a bucket of cold water. Although she appreciated the help, She couldn't help but feel like she was being abandoned in her time of greatest need. "Thank you, Mrs. Margaret," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. With a sense of helplessness, Emma decided she couldn't stay in the city. The thought of seeing James marry another woman while she raised his child alone was too painful. "I have to leave," she thought. "I have to start over, somewhere where nobody knows us." She spent the next few weeks planning her departure in secret. She sold some of her belongings to raise more money and looked for a place where she could settle down far from the shadow of Mrs. Margaret's family. Every day, she felt that her decision was the right one, even though the fear of the unknown accompanied her constantly. Finally, the day of her departure arrived. Emma packed her few belongings and, with a heavy heart, said goodbye to the house that had been her refuge. Mrs. Margaret, although worried, respected her decision. "Emma, you will always have a place here if you decide to return," she said, giving her one last hug. Emma left the city at dawn, on the first train out. As she looked out the window, she felt a mixture of sadness and hope. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to give her son a better life, far from the complications and betrayals she had left behind. Emma got off the train with a worn suitcase in one hand and a small bag of food in the other. The fresh country air enveloped her, filling her lungs with a sense of tranquility and nostalgia. She had returned to the place where it all began, her old home, the village that watched her grow up, and that would now be the refuge for her and her unborn child. The first few days in the village were not easy. Emma felt the curious glances and whispered conversations of the neighbors. She knew that the return of a young pregnant woman, alone and without the child's father, would generate speculation. However, she stood firm, determined to build a new life for herself and Daniel. At the local market, Emma found a small, unoccupied stall. With the little savings she had left, she decided to rent it and start selling fresh vegetables. Each morning before dawn, she would go to nearby farms to get the freshest produce and would return to the market to set up her stall. With patience and kindness, she began to gain regular customers, and little by little, her business began to prosper. Months passed, and Emma's belly grew, as did her determination. Despite the hardships and long work days, she always found a moment to rest and talk to her unborn son. "Daniel," she would whisper softly, "I promise to give you a life full of love and care. We will be strong together." Finally, one rainy night, Emma felt the time had come. Between pains and contractions, she prepared to bring Daniel into the world. With the help of a local midwife, Emma gave birth to a healthy and beautiful baby boy. Looking at her son for the first time, she felt a wave of love and protection. "Welcome to the world, Daniel," she said, tears of joy in her eyes. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Emma quickly adapted to her new life as a single mother and worker. Although the difficulties did not diminish, her love for Daniel gave her the strength to overcome each obstacle. She worked tirelessly at her vegetable stand, carrying Daniel on her back in a baby carrier, and always found time to play and laugh with him. Life in the village was modest, but Emma made sure that Daniel had everything he needed. She surrounded him with love, teaching him from an early age the values of honesty, hard work, and perseverance. Every night, before putting him to bed, she would tell him stories about her own childhood in the village, about her mother and father, and about the bright future she dreamed of for him. Despite the harshness of her situation, Emma found solace in the simplicity of her daily life. Daniel's smiles, his first steps, and his laughter filled her heart with joy. Every small achievement of her son was a victory for her, a confirmation that, despite everything, she was doing the right thing. However, not everything was easy. Emma faced constant economic and social challenges. Some neighbors still whispered behind her back, and there were times when the money was not enough to cover all their needs. But Emma did not let herself be defeated. She looked for ways to save and improve her business, always with Daniel's well-being in mind. One day, while she was organizing her stall at the market, an elderly woman approached her. "I have heard about you, Emma," said the woman with a kind smile. "Your strength and determination are admirable. If you ever need help, don't hesitate to ask me." Emma thanked her sincerely, feeling that little by little she was earning the respect and support of the community. Years passed, and Daniel grew, becoming a cheerful and curious child. Emma saw in him the hope and future she had always wanted. She knew her decision to return to the village and start over had been the right one. Despite the difficulties, she had found a place where they could thrive together. As time went by, Emma saw how her small vegetable business grew and became a fundamental part of the local market. The neighbors, who initially looked at her with suspicion, began to admire her dedication and work ethic. Every morning before dawn, Emma was at her stall, carefully organizing the fresh produce she brought from nearby farms. Her smile and friendly demeanor attracted a loyal clientele that spread by word of mouth. "Good morning, Emma," Mrs. Rosa, one of her regular customers, would greet her. "You have beautiful carrots today. How is Daniel?" "Thank you, Mrs. Rosa. Daniel is doing very well, growing fast. He's already starting to read on his own," Emma would reply proudly as she weighed the carrots. Each conversation with her customers reminded her of the importance of her effort and the love she put into everything she did. As her business flourished, Emma allocated a portion of her earnings to savings and another to improving their small home. She bought books for Daniel, educational toys, and new clothes. Their little house, although modest, was filled with laughter and happy moments. The walls were decorated with Daniel's drawings and schoolwork, a testament to the love and attention Emma gave him. The bond between mother and son grew stronger every day. Daniel was a curious and energetic boy, always asking questions and exploring the world around him. Emma taught him the values she had learned throughout her life, the importance of honesty, hard work, and respect for others. "Daniel, never forget that everything we do has a purpose," Emma would tell him as she read him a story before bed. "We work hard to live with dignity and to help those around us." "I know, Mom. I want to be as strong as you when I grow up," Daniel would reply, hugging his mother lovingly. Life in the village had its challenges, but Emma always found ways to overcome them. When the market was slower, she would look for opportunities to diversify her offerings, incorporating fresh, healthy products that attracted more customers. Her dedication and adaptability allowed her to keep her business growing. Over time, Emma was able to afford some home improvements. She installed a small wood-burning stove that kept the house warm during the cold winters and fixed the roof to prevent leaks. Each improvement was a small victory, proof of her ability to provide a better life for Daniel. The years passed, and the relationship between Emma and Daniel became deeper. They shared not only the work at the market, but also the small, everyday moments that filled their lives with meaning. Daniel, now a teenager, helped his mother in the business and proved to be as hard-working and determined as she was. "Mum, I've been thinking about new ideas for the stall," Daniel said one day while they were having dinner. "We could sell fruit and make fresh juices. People would love it." Emma smiled, proud of her son's initiative. "That's a great idea, Daniel. We can try it and see how people respond. I'm sure they'll love it." Together, they began to implement Daniel's ideas, further diversifying their business. The popularity of the stall increased, and Emma could see how her hard work and dedication were paying off. More than just a livelihood, the business had become a symbol of their struggle and their triumph over adversity. The passage of time began to leave its mark on Emma's health. What were initially simple aches and occasional fatigue soon transformed into a constant weakness that prevented her from performing her daily tasks with the same energy as before. Despite her strength and determination, Emma knew something was wrong. One morning, while she was preparing the stall with Daniel, she felt a wave of dizziness that forced her to sit down. "Mom, are you okay?" Daniel asked, worried. "I just need to rest for a bit, son," Emma replied with a forced smile, trying not to alarm her son. But Daniel was not easily fooled. Worry began to settle in his young heart, seeing how his mother, his pillar, was beginning to slowly crumble. The news of Emma's illness soon reached the ears of Claire, a family friend who had always shown genuine kindness towards them. Claire, with her generous heart, didn't hesitate to offer her help. "Emma, let me help you with the market and at home. You can't keep carrying everything on your own," she said in a soft but firm voice. Emma, although proud and accustomed to fending for herself, accepted Claire's help, knowing that her health and Daniel's well-being depended on it. Claire became a constant and comforting presence, taking on many of the responsibilities that Emma could no longer handle. Her help was a blessing in such difficult times. Meanwhile, worry for Daniel's future consumed Emma. The nights were filled with insomnia and dark thoughts about what would happen to her son if she wasn't there to take care of him. She decided she had to prepare Daniel for any eventuality. "Daniel, come here," she said one afternoon as they were resting at home. "We need to talk." Daniel sat next to his mother, noticing the seriousness in her eyes. "I want you to know that I will always be with you, even if I am not physically present," Emma began, taking her son's hand. "You have to be strong and brave. Life is hard sometimes, but I know you can overcome any obstacle." "Mom, don't say that. You're going to be okay," Daniel replied, tears welling up in his eyes. "I want you to be prepared, Daniel. I want you to know that you can always count on Claire and the friends we've made here. They will help you if you ever need it." Despite her weakness, Emma made an effort to spend quality time with Daniel. Together, they walked through the countryside, read books, and shared long conversations about life and their dreams. Emma wanted to make sure her son had beautiful memories and valuable lessons to guide him in her absence. Every day, Emma found a way to teach Daniel something new. "Look, Daniel," she would say, as she showed him how to sow seeds in the small garden they had behind the house. "Life is like these seeds. With love and care, they will grow strong and bear fruit. You have to be patient and persevering." Emma's words resonated deeply with Daniel, who, despite his youth, understood the gravity of the situation. His mother's illness forced him to mature faster than any child should, but it also gave him the opportunity to demonstrate the strength and character that Emma had instilled in him. Claire, always attentive, took care of the heavier tasks and made sure that Emma received the medical attention she needed. However, Emma knew that time was not on her side. The disease progressed inexorably, and she had to make the most of every moment she had left. One night, as they rested under the starry sky, Daniel snuggled up to his mother. "Mum, can you tell me again how you decided to come back to the village?" he asked, seeking solace in the stories he loved so much. Emma smiled, remembering the days when they made the decision to return to their roots. "It was one of the hardest decisions, but also the right one," she began. "I knew that here we could start over, away from problems and with the opportunity to build a better life. And look at us now. We've achieved so much." "Thank you for everything, Mom. I promise I'll do everything I can to make you proud," Daniel said with determination. "I have no doubt about that, Daniel," Emma replied, hugging him with all the love she could muster. "You are my pride and joy, and you always will be." As the days went by, Emma focused on ensuring Daniel had everything he needed to face the future. She taught him how to run the business, make important decisions, and trust the right people. Every lesson was imparted with care and love, knowing that these teachings would be Daniel's guide when she was gone. Elena knew her days were numbered. The disease had progressed relentlessly, and though she fought each day with admirable strength, the reality was inescapable. Her greatest concern was not her own suffering, but the future of Daniel, her son, who would now have to face life without her. One morning, as the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, Elena called Daniel to her side. In a weak but serene voice, she said, "Daniel, I want you to remember everything I've taught you. Life can be hard, but you have the strength to overcome any obstacle. I will always be with you, in your heart and in your memories." Daniel, his eyes filled with tears, nodded. "I promise I'll do everything you've taught me, Mom. I'll always make you proud." Eleanor smiled and caressed her son's cheek. "That's all I need to know, my love." The days that followed were a mixture of sadness and tenderness. Claire, as always, was there, providing support and caring for both Eleanor and Daniel. However, not even Claire could stop the inevitable. One night, as Daniel slept beside his mother, Eleanor closed her eyes for the last time, leaving this world in peace, surrounded by the love of her son. The void left by her passing was overwhelming. Daniel, despite his promise, felt lost and alone. The absence of his mother was a constant pain, a wound that seemed to have no end. The nights were the hardest, when the silence of the house became unbearable and memories of his mother enveloped him. One day, seeking comfort, Daniel went looking for Claire. He wanted to thank her for everything she had done and find in her the strength he needed to move on. However, when he arrived at Claire's house, he discovered with horror that it was empty. There was no trace of his friend, no note, no sign of where she might have gone. Claire had disappeared without a trace. Claire's disappearance only deepened Daniel's pain. He didn't understand why she had left, or what had happened. Uncertainty and fear mingled with his sadness, leaving him even more disoriented. However, in the midst of his despair, Daniel remembered his mother's words. She had always taught him to be strong, not to give up in the face of adversity. With a renewed determination, Daniel decided that he could not let himself be defeated by grief. He had to move on, not just for himself but also to honor his mother's memory. Time passed, and although the wound of losing his mother never fully healed, Daniel found a new strength within himself. One afternoon, while tending his stall at the market, Daniel found a letter hidden among the merchandise. The envelope, worn and yellowed, bore his name, written in a familiar hand. Upon opening it, he discovered a note from Claire, explaining her sudden departure. She had had to leave to attend to urgent personal matters, but promised to return as soon as she could. The letter was a balm to Daniel's heart. Although it did not answer all his questions, it gave him hope and the certainty that he was not alone. Claire would be back, and together they could face any challenge. Years had passed, and life in the small town continued its slow and peaceful course. Mrs. Margaret could not stop thinking about the mistakes she had made in the past. Guilt had accompanied her every day since Emma had left the city with Daniel, the child she had wanted so badly to protect. Sitting in her rocking chair, Mrs. Margaret recalled the conversations she had had with Emma, the sadness in her eyes and the desperation in her voice when she asked for help. She had believed she was doing the right thing by demanding that James fulfill his commitment, but now she understood that she had been wrong. How could I have been so blind? She wondered, tears welling up in her eyes. Determined to right her wrongs, Mrs. Margaret began a relentless search to find Emma and Daniel. She traveled to nearby towns, spoke with friends and acquaintances, but got no leads. As the years passed, her hope dwindled, but she never gave up. One day, while walking through the market, Mrs. Margaret overheard two women talking about a young woman who had passed away some years ago, leaving behind a young son. Her heart skipped a beat when she heard the name Emma. With trembling hands, she approached the women and asked them to tell her more. She discovered that Emma had lived in the village for some time, but that she had died from an illness. Mrs. Margaret felt the ground open up beneath her feet. Emma was dead, and she had not been able to help her. Heartbroken, she decided to visit Emma's grave. When she arrived at the small cemetery, she knelt before the simple headstone that marked Emma's resting place. "I'm so sorry, Emma," she whispered between sobs. "I failed you. I should never have left you alone." After a while, Mrs. Margaret got up and headed into town. She knew she still had a chance to redeem herself, find Daniel and take care of him as Emma would have wanted. She asked the townspeople and finally discovered that Daniel was living alone, taking care of the business his mother had started. Mrs. Margaret went to the market where she found Daniel working diligently at his stall. When he saw her, he was surprised. He did not recognize her, but something in the elderly woman's gaze seemed familiar. "Are you Daniel?" Mrs. Margaret asked softly. "Yes, I am," Daniel replied, a little wary. "I am Mrs. Margaret," she said, tears in her eyes. "I am your grandmother. I'm here to ask for your forgiveness for not helping your mother the way I should have, and also to fulfill a promise, to take care of you and support you in whatever you need." Daniel, though puzzled, could see the sincerity in Mrs. Margaret's eyes. "My mother told me about you," he said finally. "She always said that you were a good person, even though you had made some difficult decisions." Mrs. Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of her mistakes. "Yes, I made many mistakes, but I want to make amends for what I can. I want to help you, Daniel." From that day forward, Mrs. Margaret and Daniel began to build a relationship based on respect and mutual understanding. Mrs. Margaret taught him everything she knew about life and business, and Daniel showed Mrs. Margaret a strength and determination that filled her with pride. In time, Mrs. Margaret became a mother figure to Daniel. She supported him every step of the way, making sure he had the opportunities that Emma had always wanted for him. Under her guidance, the business prospered even more, and Daniel became a respected and beloved young man in the community. Every year, on the anniversary of Emma's death, Mrs. Margaret and Daniel would visit her grave. "I promise you, Emma," Mrs. Margaret would say, "I can't undo the past, but I can make sure your son has the future you deserve." Daniel, touched by Mrs. Margaret's words, would always add, "Thank you, Mom. Everything I am is thanks to you." Time passed, And though the wound of losing Emma never fully healed, Daniel and Mrs. Margaret found solace in their love for one another and the promise to take care of each other. Life, with all its trials and tribulations, had forged a new and stronger family, one based on love, redemption, and hope. The story presented tells the story of Emma, a young woman who, after losing her parents in a tragic accident, embarks on a quest for a new beginning in the city. Along her journey, Emma faces countless challenges and finds crucial support in Mrs. Margaret to rebuild her life. One of the most impressive aspects of this story is Emma's transformation from a vulnerable and lost teenager to a strong and independent woman. Her path is full of difficulties, from the grief of losing her parents to the struggle to survive in an unknown city. However, her determination and Mrs. Margaret's kindness allow her to find a new sense of purpose and stability. The most profound humanitarian lesson in this tale is resilience in the face of adversity. Emma demonstrates that, despite tragedies and challenges, it is possible to rebuild a life full of hope and possibilities. Her ability to move on and build a better future for herself and her son is an inspiration to all. If you find the characters' journeys inspiring, like and comment to share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories that highlight the power of connection and human kindness. Thank you for watching.